Hello, students! Have you ever looked at a map of the world and wondered why we have countries like Germany, France, and Italy? Well, I can tell you that Europe did not always look this way. Today, we are going to explore a very powerful idea that completely changed the map of Europe in the 19th century. That idea is nationalism. We will see exactly how the modern nation-state was born. Now, many of us think that nationalism is just a feeling of patriotism, a love for our country. But that is only one part of the story. The truth is, nationalism in Europe grew from some very big social and economic changes that were taking place. It was not just an idea that came from nowhere. It was actually a result of a world that was changing very, very fast. So let's see what we are going to cover in our lesson today. First, we will look at Europe's old social structure. Then, we will learn about the new social classes that were emerging. After that, we'll understand the very important idea of liberalism. We'll also see its two sides, political and economic. And finally, we will discover who became the main supporters of this idea of a nation. All right, let's begin with our first section. To understand the big changes that happened, we must first understand what Europe was like before. You have to forget the map of Europe that we know today. It was a continent of huge empires, and it was ruled by a small group of powerful people called aristocrats. You see, in the middle of the 18th century, there was no Germany or Italy as we know them. Europe was like a patchwork quilt, made of many different kingdoms, duchies, and big empires. For example, look at the Habsburg Empire. It ruled over so many different people: Austrians, Hungarians, Italians, and many more. They all spoke different languages and had different cultures. There was no feeling of a shared identity that could unite them. So at that time, European society was clearly divided into two main groups. At the top, you had the aristocracy. They were a very small group, but they owned almost all the land and held all the political power. In their high society, they even spoke French to show they were different. And at the bottom was the peasantry. They were the majority of the population. They worked on the land as tenants or even as serfs, which means they were tied to the land and had to serve their lords. But this old system, this old social order, was about to face a huge challenge. And this challenge came from something that would change the world forever: industrialization. As new factories were built, new kinds of people and new ideas also started to appear. Industrialization started first in England. And then during the 19th century, it spread to other parts of Europe, like France and the German states. Because of new factories and trade, towns and cities started growing very fast. And in these new towns, completely new social groups began to form, groups that did not belong to the old system of aristocrats and peasants. So, who are these new people? Well, first there was the working class, who worked in the factories. But the most important new group for our topic is the middle class. This was a new class made up of industrialists, businessmen, and professionals like doctors, lawyers, and teachers. Their position in society came from their profession or their business, not from being born into a noble family. Now, this is a very important point, so please pay close attention. It was this new, educated middle class that started to feel that the old system of aristocratic privileges was unfair. It was a barrier to their own growth. So it was this middle class that started to demand national unity and a nation with equal rights for all citizens. Now, for this new middle class to bring about change, they needed a powerful idea, a philosophy to unite them. And they found it in the idea of liberalism. So let's now move to our third section and understand what exactly liberalism was. The word liberalism comes from the Latin word liber, which means free. So for the new middle class, liberalism stood for two very important things. First, freedom for every individual, and second, equality of all people before the law. In a society with kings and serfs, these were very revolutionary ideas indeed. So what did these liberals actually want? Let's look at their political demands. They wanted an end to autocracy, which is the rule of one person, like a king. They demanded a government that was based on a constitution and was run by elected representatives in a parliament. And, very importantly, they also wanted the government to protect private property. Now, here is a very important term that you must remember for your exams. The term is suffrage. Suffrage is a simple word, but it has a very powerful meaning. It just means the right to vote. This brings us to a very interesting question. Liberals were talking about equality of all before the law. So, did this mean that everyone should get the right to vote? Did it mean universal suffrage? What do you think? The answer, which might surprise you, is no. In the early 19th century, equality did not mean that everyone had the right to vote. The right to vote was only given to men who owned property. All women and all men who did not own property were not allowed to vote. This was a major limitation of early liberalism. Okay, so we have seen what political liberalism meant. But for the new businessmen and traders of the middle class, freedom was also needed in another area, in the economy. This brings us to our fourth section, where we'll look at economic liberalism. So what did economic liberalism mean? It was very simple. It stood for freedom of markets. Businessmen wanted the government to remove all the different taxes and restrictions on the movement of goods from one place to another. They wanted to create one unified economic territory where trade could happen smoothly. To understand why this was so important, let's take a simple example. Imagine that you are a merchant in 1833 in the German-speaking regions, and you have to transport your goods from a city called Hamburg to another city called Nuremberg. On this one journey, can you believe it? You would have to pass through 11 different customs barriers. And at each barrier, you had to pay a customs duty, a tax. Not only that, each region had its own system of weights and measures, and its own currency. It was a complete mess and made trade very difficult. So the solution came in 1834. A customs union was formed, called the Zollverein. Now, what did this union do? It removed most of the tariff barriers. And look at this. It reduced the number of currencies from over 30 all the way down to just 2. This made trade much, much easier and faster. And this was not just about business. It was also about building a nation. Look at what a famous economist of that time, Friedrich List, said. He said that the goal of the Zollverein was to bind all the Germans economically into a nation. So you see, creating one market was seen as a way of creating one nation. So let us now bring all these points together. We have seen social changes, new economic demands, and new political ideas. In our final section, we will see how all of this came together and who became the new champions of nationalism. So, what was this simple formula for national unity? Well, let's revise. First, you had the rise of a new, educated, and ambitious middle class. Second, this class was inspired by the powerful ideas of liberalism. And together, this class and its ideas became the main force that demanded the creation of a unified nation. It's a very important connection to remember. So, we have seen how industrialization and liberalism prepared the ground for nationalism. But this leads us to a big question for the future. What would happen when these new ideas of a nation clashed with the old, powerful empires? It was this clash, this conflict, that would eventually create the modern nations of Europe that we see on the map today.